that's why indigenous peoples of the Americas have a very similar DNA admixture as people in this region, because they're the ones who populated it. And I'd be looking around the room and I felt like I was in East Asia. I felt like I was in China. The morphology of faces and so on was so similar. Here we get lost thinking that, there are that we divide the world up by countries. And so it makes me wonder, just for those of you who believe in a God who created everything, it makes me wonder, since this is what God sees, we have a long history in the United States of taking Native American children, forcing them, basically kidnapping them from their communities and putting them into schools. Remember that I showed you this slide the other day about human migration patterns, that Homo sapiens, Homo erectus, start right here and then move out around the world. Okay, well, one pattern is to go up here into Northeastern Asia and across the Bering Straits and then to populate the Americas. And that's why indigenous peoples of the Americas, and by indigenous we mean the kind of original people who populated a particular area of the world, the indigenous peoples of the Americans have a very similar DNA admixture as people in this region, because they're the ones who populated it. So naturally. So, I remember, for example, when I was living in Ecuador, and I was living in the mountains of this province called Azuay, and it's a very, with a very large indigenous population, Los Indios, the Indians of that particular region, right? And so we're talking right here. Okay. And I would spend a lot of time studying the Catholic Church and priests and nuns and social change activities that they were doing. And I spent a lot of time in indigenous communities. And I was in many communities that didn't have electricity. And so there were times when I'd be sitting around a big circle of people, and that you would have these community gatherings, and there'd be some candles in the room because that was the only light. And I'd be looking around the room and I felt like I was in East Asia. I felt like I was in China, like it seemed like it was, because everyone was, all the appearances, physical appearances, and morphology of faces and so on was so similar. And so I'm reminded of that when I look at this map, that people around the world, we like to pretend now, or have this idea, or we get lost thinking that, there are that we divide the world up by countries, but we don't divide the world up by countries. Countries are artificial creations. They're not artificial, but they're creations that came much later, the idea of nation states, that this is what the world looks like without these borders. So if you go to the next slide, and here in the Americas, this is now Central America and Mexico and North America. You can kind of see some things that you recognize. But the border here comes down this way, right? The border between the U.S. and Mexico. And of course, when the indigenous peoples populated this land, they populated all of this land, and they didn't stop at any borders. So there's a fluid, fluidity in the different groups, populations, tribes, peoples in this area. So just as an example, the very first people, these were colleagues of mine who were collecting DNA samples to study biogeographical ancestry, meaning that, you could identify the genetic markers of people in different areas of the world. So, when you take a test, those of you who have taken a test, that's how they can identify where your ancestors came from. And when they took the test for Native Americans up here, they sampled the Indians, they sampled indigenous peoples down here, which is in Mexico today, to get the same ancestry to understand if people were native peoples up here in North America. And I say that also, the other thing I want to say is that it says something about this debate that we have today and the arguments we have today over immigration, and in particular, undocumented or illegal immigration. Like there's no, the barrier that got put between Mexico and the US is put there by humans. But the indigenous peoples of the first peoples of the Americas, they didn't have borders. It's that the Europeans came and colonized this land that was other people's land. There were people living here. It wasn't empty. So even though, you don't see all these cities and so on this map that I'm showing you, people were living here. And people were pushed off the land, and then we create borders and say, okay, now you either have to live on this side or this side, but now we created a border here, and you're on that side, and you cannot come to this side because you're a citizen over there, you're not a citizen here. But they didn't do that. Like, they didn't create that. It got created for them. And so it makes me wonder, just for those of you who believe in a God who created everything, it makes me wonder, since this is what God sees, God doesn't see a border between the U.S. and Mexico. So who are we, the colonizers in the U.S., who put a border there? We weren't asked to, but we forced it upon the indigenous peoples living there. And then who are we to tell the people who are living, the indigenous peoples who are living in what is now Mexico, to say you're illegal if you cross that border that they never put there? And I'm only saying this rhetorically, by the way, as something to just think about, just to have when we get into this debate about immigration and illegal or undocumented immigration, it's just worth having some little bit of compassion or a little bit of just at least wrestle with some of these thoughts and terms and, way of seeing it. Okay, anyway, next slide. So, in 1978, in the United States, we passed this Indian Child Welfare Act. And the Child Welfare Act was to prioritize the placement of indigenous children into indigenous homes. And the act was an attempt to recover or to resolve or to help just alleviate some of the deep damages that came historically or come when you take children out of their community and put them into another community that is very different from theirs. And it has, leaves a lot of really deep wounds to do that. And so in the United States, so what's interesting is the reason this comes up is because the Supreme Court just last summer voted 7-2 that this Welfare Act is constitutional. And what the act says is that states have to do everything in their power to ensure that indigenous children, if they are placed into adoption, are placed with indigenous families. So they stay in their communities as much as possible. And it's an attempt to kind of recoup some of the damages, right? So I think it was really fascinating. It really jumped out for me. But if you go to the next slide, we have a long history in the United States after, starting in the late 19th century, of taking American Indian, Native American children, forcing them, basically kidnapping them from their communities and putting them into schools, American Indian schools. And this is one, these are all Native kids who were taken from their families, forcefully taken from their families and put into this school. This is the Carlisle School, just about 100 miles south of here. So imagine the damages done to all these kids. And the attempt was to civilize them because, we had to do something about all these indigenous Native American people in this land. And we didn't know what to do because after we took the land and forced them into very small communities, reservations and so on, and genocided, killed so many, millions and millions. We're trying to figure out how to rectify this, what to do. So we did that. So in part, this act is an attempt to deal with that, okay?